Let me share my screen so we can start the session. Okay. Can you all see my screen? I think it's fine now.
Yes, we can.
Okay, floor is yours, Hailey.
Thank you so much and welcome everybody. We're so excited to have you here today. We have a collaborative notes document, so please sign in, take notes. We will be using it throughout the session. Thank you so much for joining us and welcome to MaLDReTH 2.0, Advancing Tool Interoperability in the Research Data Lifecycle. I am Hallie Burns. I am one of the co-chairs for this session. I am located in the United States at Princeton University, and I'm very excited to join everyone. I'd like to introduce my other co-chairs. Rory, if you'd like to go first.
Oh, hi, I'm Rory McNeil with my work with ResearchBase, and I'm based in Edinburgh in Scotland.
Thank you. And Adam.
Hi, everyone. My camera's acting up, so it's just my lovely voice today. I'm Adam Bilesmoor. I work for JISC in the UK, currently in lovely sunny Liverpool.
Thank you so much, everyone. Next slide, please. So today we will be going through a welcome and MaLDReTH 1.0 overview. We will be then moving into a discussion on the MaLDReTH 2.0 working areas. We will discuss our collaboration with GORC 2, community engagement, and then there will be an open discussion and a very quick next steps section. Next slide, please. So in order for us to get an idea of everyone in the room, if you wouldn't mind, please going to menti.com and adding the code 22938893. Or additionally, you can scan the QR code using your phone. There's a number of different questions just for us to get to know you a little bit better.
Okay, so let me quickly go over to the Menti now. Oops, sorry. There it is. Right.
So we'll just give it a couple of minutes to see where everyone is from. Thank you for putting the link to the Menti in there, CJ. Yes, the code is 22938893. Wonderful. Looks as though we have a good spread of people from all over the world. Thank you so much for joining us today. Athena, the next, oh, we've still got some coming in. Wonderful, wonderful. Let's go to the next one, Athena. So we're interested to know, what is your position? What is your job title? How do you work with research data infrastructure? Got data steward, data manager, wonderful. Very cool. Okay. looks as though we have a wide spread of answers here, largely data managers, data stewards, data librarians, but also curator, CEO, project lead, analyst, data specialist. Wonderful. Engagement and community. This is wonderful. Thank you all. And then next one, please. So there's a number of different stages as part of the MaLDReTH framework. We are curious, moving forward, which stages of the MaLDReTH cycle do you see yourself using the most? Very interesting. Looks like we have quite a few people here under publish. That's awesome. Publish, store. That makes sense, Andrew. Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you, Athena. Can we head back to the slides?
Of course. Just a minute. There we go. I think we should be right here. Great.
Thank you so much. So thank you all for bearing with us, and it's so excited to meet all of you. For those of you who are new or unaware, this is MaLDReTH 2.0. We are following up on the MaLDReTH 1.0 outputs. A brief overview, there's a number of different outputs that took place. MaLDReTH 1.0 particularly focused on creating this research data lifecycle model. There was also a mapping of research tools database and a prototype database that was created by members of our team. All of those can be found as part of the original MaLDReTH 1.0 website on the RDA page on the RDA website. But what we really want to focus on today is our movement into MaLDReTH 2.0 and how we plan on expanding this in the future. So I will pass this to, I believe, Adam.
Yeah, this is the bit where I struggled to find the right unmute button. Hello, everyone. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about what our plans are for establishing the next working group, what we're thinking of producing, and the kind of like direction of travel, although I thought I'd never actually say that out loud. So MaLDReTH 1 was around mapping the landscape of the data lifecycle and finding stages, sub-stages, which were tool categories and exemplars for each of those tools. What we're looking at in the next stages are focusing on like the standardization of the approaches, looking at documentation patterns, and also, really importantly, sustainability. So one of the things that we're really thinking about is doing all of this work and then making sure that it has a way to live on. And that last point is kind of a theme that runs through both the previous version of this work and the upcoming version. That engagement, this is a community collaborative co-design project. It is not for us to declare something, it's not build it and they will come, it's build together. Next slide, please. So we're looking at kind of how we map the various connections between the tools that are connected to the research data lifecycle. We're looking at kind of, you can see from the diagram there, maybe characterizing the different ways that tools connect. I'll come on to that in a minute. We're looking at building out not just how tools relate to the research data lifecycle, but how they relate to each other. At the minute, we have a thought on a pattern for that. And again, those kind of interrupt claims need to be made with validation from the community. So in MaLDReTH 1, we had working groups and teams where we looked at each of our stages, thought about different categories of tools and the ways that they might be illustrated. In 2, we're looking at kind of how these things connect, how we would kind of generalize some patterns for those connections, and how those additional characteristics can help with understanding the infrastructure that we use. And just a note there for the fair implementation profile, which we think can be a useful kind of adjunct to that. Next slide, please. So here is something that I kind of generated as an idea or maybe an underpinning schema for this. You'll see there's some points on kind of like the tool identity, data compatibility, the API connection mapping, but these are just kind of like thoughts. And again, we'll work together to try and figure out these are good thoughts, the most useful characteristics, and so on. It's important that we have these kind of like machine readable tool profiles that we can, again, create these tool chains and infrastructure in a way that's standardized, in a way that makes sense, and we can build kind of like, automatic toolchain assembling pieces of infrastructure. So we already have things like the Fair Digital Object Framework, schema.org, DDI, code meta. We've got lots of different ways of talking about tools, but they're kind of a little bit partial in if you actually want to think about how they interrelate to each other. And one of the things that we're, again, looking at here is making sure that there's something that will encapsulate the way that tools can interrelate. Next slide, please. So this is very much a proposal at the moment. And it's just kind of an exemplar of things that we might produce. So these are some potential tool integration patterns, thinking about how things relate to each other with direct APIs, with shared storage, through an authorization gateway. And I think certainly whenever I was writing a lot of Perl through standard format exchange, this idea of here's the tool output, let's do some kind of processing on it, and then put it back into the next thing in the tool chain. And again, characterizing these patterns, characterizing tools that are interrelating with these different patterns helps us to understand the kind of requirements and demands and resourcing that we need in order to build the tool chains for dealing with the various stages of the data lifecycle. And it allows us, when we're looking at infrastructure, to position it both within the research data lifecycle, but within our kind of wider infrastructure as well. Next slide, please. So how are we going to do this? Well, I think I might have potentially stressed this a little bit, but this is co-design collaborative effort. This is a set of kind of development, feedback, and implementation meetings. And so what we'll be doing is we'll be, as well as holding the kind of like regular working group meetings, we'll be having a series of workshops. Now, these will have a focus. So I've got these kind of 3 ideas around kind of schema development, integration patterns, and validation frameworks. And you'll see in the bullet, we've got potential kind of like timings for these, depending, of course, on the time that the working group all gets set up and started. But the main thing to point out here is these are workshops not just to develop something, but for those that are in the process of either embedding MaLDReTH or the kind of technical frameworks and patterns that we are developing to come along and showcase what they've done, get feedback. And that kind of like 2-partner model means that, again, as we develop things, we are steered by those who are using, developing, and implementing them. Next slide, please. And CJ.
Hey, so as Adam was explaining what MaLDReTH is and then leading into what MaLDReTH 2 is going to look like, part of the work that was kind of identified as MaLDReTH was happening and the GORC groups were occurring, especially the International Model Working Group. It was identified that we had some areas of collaborative effort. I wouldn't say overlap, and that's kind of where this is going, is we saw areas of complement. And so part of the work, in addition to what Adam has already covered, is something that I'm going to be talking about, which is where our two groups can interconnect and move both of our outputs and plans forward. Before I get into that, though, I did want to say a little bit about what GORC is. So the Global Open Research Commons, or as we normally call it, GORC, is this kind of grand idea of research commons being interoperable. So they're connected to each other, there's seamless access between them, and really to this realized vision of frictionless access to all research artifacts to researchers everywhere at all times with the appropriate privacy and security protocols in place. It is a very large idea, and so the GORC interest group was created to kind of bring people together in the RDA to talk about what that might look like, how that might happen. They tasked themselves with creating a roadmap to really address that. How would you create the GORC, or how would we get there? It was determined very quickly that there needs to be working groups to kind of piece this work together and look at things at a smaller scale first that build up into the roadmap. And so we also have a collection of GORC working groups, one of which created the model, and then others now that are looking at profiles, mappings, and other connection points. And so these individual outputs at the working group level are for commons level, so individual organizations or partnerships between organizations that will then feed into the roadmap, which is at this global level, and then we head into the GORC. So that's just a little background on the GORC groups, and that's why it's kind of like a multiple. The Global Open Research Commons International Implementations Working Group, or GORC 2. So I do want to say that it's not 2 as in the number 2, it's like 2 is in the Roman numeral 2, because we did a little bit of a play on 2 I's for international implementations. All right, so next slide, Athena, if that's okay. We do have some supporting outputs as well, and these kind of came out at the same time as the MaLDReTH outputs as in addition. And we were really fortunate to have Rory as one of the key leaders in some of our outputs, which is where we kind of first identified, Rory brought it up, being a co-chair of MaLDReTH 1, that, hey, there's some collaborative work here that we can do together. So some of the outputs we have that are really key, if you haven't seen them before, is the GORC interest group typology and definitions, which gets more into the definition of a commons, as well as the essential elements of the commons. And so the essential breakdown is that a commons would have something in each essential element. You've got human or social elements in white there, so governance structures or governance and leadership, sometimes how it's called, engagement, sustainability, rules of participation and access, and human capacity. And then also technical or infrastructure elements, which are ICT, infrastructure, research objects, and services and tools, and holding everything together, and then also looking outside, or that central element or core element that does both, which is standards and conventions. Next slide, please. The International Model Working Group was the first working group, and that's where some of these collaborations with MaLDReTH were really found. And this group is now complete. We did, reach the deliverables that we wanted, which was creating a model of what a commons may consider to become part of the GORC. The model is non-prescriptive. It's a set of considerations that kind of break down each of the essential elements into entities and characteristics of the various considerations that a commons might have. It's not a checklist. You don't have to have everything in there. It is quite detailed, but it's intended to provide a little bit of insight into what can be inside each of these essential elements. It was first submitted as a supporting output in 2023, and then an RDA recommendation in 2024, and it does have an accompanying report. The report is narrative and a little easier to digest if you haven't opened that the spreadsheet before, which hosts the model currently. Next slide, please. We do, however, now have GORC 2, or international implementations, and we have a set of deliverables and intended outcomes. So the 3 deliverables on the left-hand side are essentially implementations of the model. So how would the items in the model actually come to realization or fruition? We're working with the National Data Services group for profiles on that, as well as existing profiles from our speaker series. The second deliverable is improved navigation and use of the model, which dives into a bunch of things. First and foremost being, of course, spreadsheets aren't great as a knowledge transfer method. So we're looking at changing that. We want to improve our documentation, but most relevant to this group is model mappings and connections to existing frameworks, models, vocabularies, and principles. And so while mapping may not be the right word for MaLDReTH, and I'll talk about why in a moment, definitely the connections are really key. And for the outcomes that we see on the right-hand side, and it looks like the numbering got messed up, my bad. It's really focusing on showcasing where existing frameworks and models have gaps, connect together, and complement each other, which is really where this deliverable matches up with the outcome we want and where we're hoping to work with MaLDReTH to identify how that works. Next slide, please. So the deliverable mainly related to MaLDReTH is those mapping and connections. And what we're really looking for is how a commons or infrastructure would use both the MaLDReTH outputs and the GORK outputs and complement. We don't think one overtakes the other or can be substituted. We do really think that there's space for both of them to exist and be used in complement for the best outcome for these research infrastructures and ultimately for researchers themselves. We would like to form a task group to work together and determine, first of all, how would they fit together? And then the when, where, and how a commons would use each model individually. So really diving into all of those pieces that would come with where those connection points are between the two models or frameworks. And just on the left-hand side, there's little bits of previews of some of the work that Rory, Adam, and I have been doing in the background to determine where does MaLDReTH fit, where does GORK fit, who are our intended audiences, and that sort of thing. And kind of through these conversations, we found that MaLDReTH really focuses on the practical day-to-day tools for the researcher. It's researcher focused when compared to GORK, which is a little broader and really talking to the people that are developing the platforms themselves. So all part of the same picture, but looking at different perspectives from different roles. And we think that that's why they can fit together pretty good. Next slide, please. This is something that's background work in terms of a GORK interaction onion. Because GORK kind of covers so much of what research commons can be, and there's all kinds of pieces that fit into a research commons. This obviously has a lot of connections throughout the RDA. And so it's a little hard to see on the slide here, but when they're shared in the collaborative notes, you can zoom in a little bit more. We have kind of like the middle, which is these GORK groups. We have a lot of interaction points together. We have a lot of shared co-chairs, that sort of thing. But then the next layer out is cooperation. And because we would like to work closely with MaLDReTH to find those connection points, as well as the National Data Services Interest Group for Profiles, which is a different deliverable, we really see it as working really closely with MaLDReTH and NDS. But we do also have our eyes out on other groups as well to work with, not maybe in the same intensity, but certainly to also keep aware of their outputs at the very least. Next slide, please. And so the work done so far, we have looked at a one-way mapping from MaLDReTH to GORK, and that was before we really had ascertained that a mapping wasn't quite right. They were better to be in complement and find connections, but we had kind of done this mapping. That's what led to that kind of realization. And we have created a 2-pager, which I published on Zenodo like 15 minutes ago. So you can find it linked there in the slides, and I can put it in the collaborative notes here in a moment. So you can have a look at exactly all the bits and pieces that we are looking at together. And again, some more output that's kind of reflected in that 2-pager on the right-hand side around where MaLDReTH fits and where GORK fits. Next slide, please. So this is a very short introduction to the mapping that I had done from MaLDReTH to GORK, that one-way mapping. And so on the left-hand side, what you're seeing are the GORK categories in services and tools element. So it's it's not even all the details in GORK. It's very much the high level. Those are just the entities, not even their characteristics or anything like that. And on the right-hand side, these should now be familiar because we saw them in the Menti, are some of the phases that were identified from MaLDReTH. And so, again, if you click the next button, as if you were to change slides, we should see some arrows pop up. Perfect. This is the mapping that I had done. And unsurprisingly, what we had kind of found is that pretty much all or most of the phases identified in MaLDReTH fit within the researcher-focused categories and categories mostly in GORK. And so this doesn't necessarily capture all of MaLDReTH, though, because there's a lot of nuance that's not being taken into account in this one-way mapping. So this was where this conversation on connection came in to say, clearly just by having these kind of really short summarized categories in GORK, we're missing all of the detail that MaLDReTH actually includes in their model, but we don't need to recreate it. We just need to link them together appropriately and indicate when a commons may use one or the other, depending on what they're trying to accomplish and who's looking at it. Next slide, please. And so some suggestions for the future and how we'd like to work together. Again, we would like to have this task force between our groups to make sure that we can connect the initiatives more effectively, to help organizations decide when to use each model, create the guidelines for how to use them in conjunction or in tandem, depending on how that looks. And ideally, it's to really prevent duplicate efforts between our two groups, and maximize the benefit for the research community, which is why we're here, of course. So we do suspect, and some first steps again from this mapping, from discussions that have already happened, we do suspect that there's going to be a lot of connection with the services and tool essential element in the GORC model, but there could be other connections too, and we really want to investigate all of those things. And one of the ideas that we had as a first kind of foray into identifying what those connections are is giving them some names through the OWL web ontology and identifying relationships. So are there some items in GORC that are parent relationship to things in MaLDReTH or vice versa, or are they related in other ways? And can we use some of the terms that we already have to identify them? And so with that, I think it's back to your MaLDReTH co-chairs to continue to talk about community engagement.
Okay, so it's Rory here. Thanks a lot, CJ. That was great, very useful, and thanks also to your fellow co-chair Andrew for joining us today, or in Andrew's case, this evening, or actually tomorrow morning. Special thanks. So I would just like to say, as someone who also is involved in and worked on GORC, I think it's really exciting and extremely appropriate that after pretty extensive discussions, actually, on how we might think about working together, that we being GORC and MaLDReTH, and as you said, CJ, having some initial ideas which were quite in a way unrefined. We've now, as CJ has very nicely articulated, come up with I think a broader framework and a good framework for going forward. And as CJ says, to try to get benefit from both of the models and the way that the community is working together, being more efficient, but also I think kind of adding value to the whole process. So thanks to both of you for being here today and for participating in our session, and we're really looking forward to working with you. It's exciting. So Hallie has given you an introduction to very briefly the history, and I realized actually that for those of you who aren't very familiar with MaLDReTH, you probably need to do a little bit of digging. Maybe the 2-pager wouldn't be a bad place to start to get a better sense of what we've done so far. But we've set the scene a little bit, and then Hallie's given you a sense of what we're planning to do, and then Andrew is Adam has then given you more of a detailed sense of the actual things that we're planning. And I think Adam actually quite usefully alluded to what the process is, as well as to the substance of what we're planning to do. So in a way, some of the things that I'm about to discuss in this community engagement section are actually revisiting what Andrew said. Sorry, Adam, what Adam said, and but doing it from a more of a process point of view, as a substance point of view. So as Adam said, the initial MaLDReTH 1.0 was very, very heavy on community engagement, and I think we had upwards of 100 people participate in various phases of coming up with the MaLDReTH map at different stages of the process, and it was really instructive and fascinating, actually, to be involved in kind of a community. A series of dynamic community brainstorming sessions, and I think everybody that was involved learned a lot. So that was really, really great, and we wanted to continue that momentum as we go forward into MaLDReTH 2.0. So this, I'm going to talk briefly in my section about engagement to date. Then I'm going to talk about what we're planning with the community engagement going forward with 2.0. What we think about in terms of community validation, and then, as Adam said, sustainability is a critical objective of one of the things we're working towards. So those are a brief overview of the segments of my session. Next slide, please. Yeah, so engagement today, I mean, it's been really interesting. Apart from the actual engagement with individuals during the creation, we discovered to our surprise and delight that even before uh, the model had been even submitted, well, I guess maybe after submission or even before submission for community review, much less approval by the RDA, institutions had begun to use it. And we just discovered this after the fact. But um, Oxford University, for example, had commissioned an external review of the research infrastructure and services that were available to their researchers, and they retained an external consultant, and they instructed this consultant to use MaLDReTH as the main reference point. So I said, wow, amazing. And then others, including UCL and JISC and the California Digital Library, also used it in a less formal way, but have already begun to use it. So that's that was positive and very exciting. We've also had some preliminary engagement with what I call synergistic initiatives. That's maybe a bit of a of a fancy term, but for example, InfraFinder, which is, for those of you who know it, it's a listing of, I think, 100 plus now open research tools that are available for people to use, and they're very nicely presented. So each tool has a profile and useful information about them, and there's a vetting process. So there's a governance aspect to it, but it doesn't have a lot of structure. And so we've had some discussions, and we're planning to have a engagement with InfraFinder to think about ways in which MaLDReTH might inform or be useful to InfraFinder in helping to provide some more structure to their listing of tools. That's one example. Then we discovered that the Flemish libraries had also already created their own. I haven't really seen it, so I don't know exactly what it is, but it's kind of a MaLDReTH-esque map. And again, they're interested in sharing experiences and talking with us. So, though, in addition uh, to institutional engagement, we've already had some engagement with some of these synergistic initiatives, and there's also been virtually no one said no, but just kind of casually when we've run into people at conferences in oh, hi Chris. Catch up with that later. um, and we've mentioned MaLDReTH, and there's interest in using MaLDReTH to assess their own research infrastructure. Next slide, please. Yeah, so what kind of stakeholders are we looking to engage with this time? Well, it's the whole panoply, really, of people who are involved in designing, implementing, thinking about, and then research infrastructures, and then making them available and assisting their researchers to use them. So it's the developers, the providers of research infrastructures. Um, it's research institutions, which that admittedly that's an institution, that's not a person. But in terms of roles, people who are involved in research data management, data stewards, and although it doesn't say it here, also more senior people who might be director of research data management or director of research services. Um, Importantly, very importantly, coming back to some of the things that Adam was stressing, tools developers, um, hoping to stimulate tools developers to think more about interoperability between tools, researchers, and then finally, funders, because at the end of the day, it's the funders that provide funding for research infrastructure as well as for research itself. Next slide, please. So, yes, I think, again, Adam has already, this is slightly repetitive or maybe coming from a different perspective, but how are we going to carry out this engagement? Well, as Adam, sorry, Adam, has already described, uh, through a series of workshops, uh, and possibly also surveys, and then in addition to that, regular meetings of the working group itself. and probably forming task groups as well to focus on particular things. So the workshops are, as compared to the MaLDReTH 1.0, where it was pretty much all done in task groups and through the RDA meetings. The workshops would be an additional thing, which would be in addition to the virtual workshops, but in addition to the monthly meetings of the working group itself and task groups. Next slide, please. So yes, I've already mentioned synergistic collaboration with synergistic initiatives, and we imagine there's others out there in addition to the two that I've already identified, and we certainly welcome people to let us know about other things that they think, other organizations or other initiatives or projects that they think would be useful for us to engage with. Next slide, please. And then the technical task groups are really the kind of vehicle through which we intend to do much of the kind of technical work, including the interoperability things, which kinds of things which Adam mentioned. And we envision having a series of deliverables for each of these, which would be in some ways analogous to, if you think of the MaLDReTH map as it exists today, 1.0 is kind of a platform, then trying to make that platform richer and instantiate it with some of the detail relating to the standards and other kinds of things which Adam mentioned. Next slide, please. And then community validation is important, and we kind of think that the model that was developed through the first MaLDReTH 1.0 is relevant here, which is really valid. I think of it personally as like validation through participation. If you have good participation from various people in the community in the actual work, that in itself is arguably the most important, I think, kind of validation you can have, because you're not just doing it in your own cave, you're actually doing it with and by the community. But then in addition to that, of course, there's the community review of deliverables, which is kind of a quality control mechanism, if you will, that comes at the end of the process. Next slide, please. Yeah, and sustainability. We've talked a lot about this, and we've thought a lot about this, and there often outputs come out of the RDA and other initiatives, but they're not really that useful unless they become sustainable. And so we think there's strong evidence that MaLDReTH, like GORC, is something which has potential value, and we want to make sure that value is achieved, but also that it remains available for people to use. And that means having some organization, probably some organization that takes on, after MaLDReTH 2.0, the responsibility of maintaining and updating the MaLDReTH map. So clearly, this is a map which it has to be dynamic. It needs to change over time. It needs to reflect developments in technology, developments in researcher and infrastructure uptake, the way institutions work, the development of multi-institutional research infrastructures like the GORC, all of those things. It needs to be dynamic, and that can only happen if someone or somebody has the responsibility and the resources to continue to, at a minimum, review and update the content, again, with community input. And secondly, there needs to be some kind of hosting platform so that it continues to be available in a form which people can access and use. So that implies that some organization needs to take this on, and that organization needs to have funding. To do that, And in addition, the organization, assuming there is some organization, there needs to be a governance mechanism in place to oversee this process, as well as kind of the administrative wherewithal to do that. So one of the things we'll be doing, which I don't think really showed up in our prospective tasks, is this exploration of sustainability. I think that's my last slide. Is that right?
It is indeed.
Okay. Yes.
So I think before we jump back into the discussion, I'd like to open up for any questions, any comments. I know there's been a few in chat. I don't know, Rory, Adam, if you've been able to see or take a look.
Yeah, so Farmer's question on adoption stories from MaLDReTH 1.0. I think, Rory, if you want, would you maybe talk about
Yeah. So
UCL?
hi, Volmar. So yeah. So basically, the ones we have so far, I think there are 4 concrete ones, and the most substantial one, and it's extremely substantial, is the one I mentioned from Oxford University. It hasn't been published, but we did have a session in December where we had a kind of a what do you call it, a workshop, or it was more of an informal discussion about some of the adoption which has taken place. So we haven't written any of them up, and one of our tasks, which to me is an aspect of both sustainability and adoption, is to, as we move forward with these workshops, to create some kind of web presence where the adoption stories that take place can actually be archived, written up, etc., and hopefully do that in a way that they can be compared and contrasted and used together. So you get kind of a library of adoption stories. So we don't have that framework yet. Yeah, none of them have been written up, but basically the ones that as I mentioned, the Oxford, which used it as a reference for a review of their research infrastructure and tools. UCL, which didn't do a formal review, but did indeed do an informal review of their infrastructure vis-a-vis MaLDReTH. JISC, which Adam, maybe you could comment on in a minute, and the last one was the California Digital Library, which provides services to all of the University of California campuses. Which again, that was more of an informal, not really review, but kind of referencing, and they've made the point to us that they think it would be a useful thing to implement as to do a more formal review with, I think there are 10 or 11, I forget how many, of the UC campuses, to do something similar, perhaps on a slightly more informal way, but in a similar way to what Oxford has done. So those are the 3 universities. And Adam, maybe you could describe a little bit how JISC has thought about this.
And there's the mute button again. Excellent. So just which is where I work, we're looking at MaLDReTH as kind of a underpinning framework for some of the discussions and outreach we do, where we talk to higher education institutions around their infrastructure, how it might fit into their procurement cycles, and how we structure some of the discussions and consultancy that we offer, so that it's kind of like an underpinning framework of the discussions around what is currently at the institution and how they might think about new things. So this is still internal work, which I don't commit too much to about yet, but it's been really useful in kind of like looking at how we progress and evolve some of the services that we offer.
All right. I mean, I guess none of those were really a tools registry, right? For the adoption stories. I think if that's the case, then it might be useful to reach out to some of the tool registries that exist and get them involved with providing some feedback or surveying. I mean, getting them to respond to some concrete questions leading into MaLDReTH 2.0.
Yeah, thanks, Wilmar. That's a good suggestion. By first of all, MaLDReTH this is actually an interesting point. It came up at the plenary in Costa Rica. MaLDReTH is not a tools registry and not intended to be a tools registry. So that's a critical point. So it's not another tools registry. And we haven't really talked too much. For those who don't know, we haven't talked too much today about what is, but as I think you know, Omar, it's a map of basically categories of tools which are used in the research data lifecycle, and then examples of tools. But it's not meant to be a place where people come to choose tools. That's not the function. It's more, and it's tied to the research data lifecycle. So it's more how categories of tools relate to the research data lifecycle is really the core feature of MaLDReTH. And so I'd say tools registries, we think of them as a relevant adjacent kind of approach to thinking about things, and maybe a little bit different, because tool registries really are intended to be a place where people would go and say, oh, I want this tool, I want that tool, and here's how I can find out about them. And we did have some fairly extensive discussion with the tools registries during MaLDReTH 1. So we're certainly aware of the tools registries, and to some extent we've already engaged with them. But I think you're right. It certainly makes sense to kind of engage with them as we move into a new phase of development of MaLDReTH. That also makes sense. Yeah. So there's a question. I don't know, Adam, do you want it? There's from you see the one from Graham Diak. Do you want to take that, Adam, or does Hallie,
Sure.
or does someone want to take it? Or
Okay, so we're rolling out improvement our research data management. How do you use MaLDReTH? We use Ccan and data catalogs to roll out a metadata layer over existing file or folder structure. So again, as Rory's been outlining, the way to use MaLDReTH at the moment is to use it as a organizing structure over the different kinds of infrastructure that you have. So in the outputs that are produced in MaLDReTH 1, we have, as well as the stages of the lifecycle and the harmonization process and all that, we have an example of the kind of like different tool categories that we see for each of those stages and exemplars of those tools. So in a way, you would be doing a reverse mapping exercise from the one we've done, where you'd be taking the tools, looking at whereabouts in the research data lifecycle they fit, putting them into the tool categorizations, and using that as a way to kind of like figure out both the tool chains and the interrelations. And obviously, it would be really interesting to discuss with you that process, as that is part of the way that we are looking then at MaLDReTH 2, because then the next thing to do would be to characterize their interconnections, and some other things about the infrastructure that'd be useful in creating that catalog. So there is a way to do it now by looking at, and maybe all the things that you have are already in the first deliverable, but maybe they're not. But then part of what we are planning on doing next is to look at how we would do this process and how we would create some of the like schema and characterizations. And again, maybe work with existing catalogs, maybe work with some of the characteristics from things like Metcat from IOI, InfoFinder, and others, so that we're not doing it all again on our own, and collaboration co-design to actually facilitate this process. So it's a great question, and the answer is some of it you could just do already, and some of it I think would be really interesting as part of the work that we have going forwards.
Sorry, Rory, can I make a comment on adoption stories?
please, Andrew. Yeah.
So this came up last week when I was presenting on the Global Open Research Commons approach to the organizational assembly. In fact, I was presenting on our 1.1 deliverable, and there was an interesting discussion there about adoption stories across the RDA in general. And I think what's going to come out of that is a greater enthusiasm by RDA to capture adoption stories for all of the different outputs that have been developed through the RDA processes, and make those more visible on the website. So this is something that might well be complementary to whatever it is you're proposing to do, but certainly I think you're going to see more adoption stories and more formalized capture of adoption stories showing up on the RDA website over time.
Yeah, well, that's great. I mean, it does seem like a bit of a gap at the moment. And what we were thinking was, if you could imagine that, again, you want to obviously leave some scope for narrative and individual description, but at the same time, if you have some kind of form or template which people all use, then it can be useful because then you can compare things easily, right? Then if you have 10 universities that go through this exercise, then you can learn things about they can learn from each other, not only from MaLDReTH but from each other, and then it becomes even more useful. So I think that's something for us to think about, is how we can facilitate that and make it easy for people. And then it would be nice if the RDA would, again, I don't know. Then the question becomes, well, okay, fine. If you get this library of adoption stories, how do you present it? Who hosts it? Is it easy to search? Those kind of things. So if the RDA through its website is able to facilitate that, that would actually be a huge contribution, I would say.
Adam, do you want to show the prototype at all?
It's a very old and slightly embarrassing kind of a thing, but I can, as long as I can do sharing screen, right, that'll be fine. Give me a second. How are we for time? Yeah.
We're doing good on time.
Someone remind me to stop talking at some point. Right, so there's a share screen somewhere around here. There we go. Right. And I've got to choose one of the 60 million tabs that I have. Here we go. And then go share. Okay, so a very long time ago, I built this thing just to kind of like think about if we have a MaLDReTH life cycle, and if we had like a way that like kind of talked about it. So this is the MaLDReTH life cycle. It's a research data life cycle. It's actually built in or from the core thing, so you can actually change all the things inside it. So it's a dynamic rendering. The idea was, hey, you could come to a bit of the cycle and you could actually say, do you know what? I want to have a look at more detail. So it conceptualized that, oh, these are the three kind of tool category substages or whatever you want to call them that are there. But I really want to know a bit more about these actual tools and schemas. So that's the very exciting schema of the underpinning SQLite that I built. And then each of these things are part of, as you can see, as you go across the scope, interop characters. These are all things that we kind of like developed for each of the stages here. And the idea again was that, you could have a bit of a search of stuff. You could see whether or not they were closed or open source. You could have whether or not they were interop. And again, as we were discussing now, we could change that now to more of an interop pattern rather than not where they are. It had all the URLs. So this was like a basic SQLite database of the actual output that we developed in deliverable 2 of MaLDReTH 1.0, which you can find on the RDA website. And then, you could render them into nice, pretty little text as well. So again, this is all kind of like a dynamic snapshot of how we would categorize and use a really, really simple tool catalog that isn't in any way as good as pretty much any of those. But the idea was that just to give kind of like a general conceptual overview, and you can go in and edit the tools and things like that. And let's see the annotation button down there. That's probably as much as I should show now, because otherwise I'll go into like the next couple of versions, and I can send some GitHub links for the two versions which are interactive and you can update the tool catalog and have a play with. But I would warn you that they are built on shockingly shonky graphic visualizations and in some ways a bit distracting. Thank you.
Yeah, Volmar's just put an interesting observation in chat. I'll just read it out here. Volmar says, I'm thinking that workflow systems like Galaxy with explicit focus on data management have tool registers with input-output port mappings and experience that might be relevant here. I think that's a really good point, actually. And since a lot of the focus of what we're going to be doing, or one of the major focuses rather, is on interoperability, that actually is a really good suggestion, and we definitely can incorporate that into plans for thinking about interoperability. Thank you. That's great. Great idea.
I think that comment segues very nicely back into our discussion. Athena, if you wouldn't mind sharing the Menti again.
Yes, no problem.
Thank you.
Okay, so
So if you're willing to go back to our Menti, you can go to menti.com and once again use the code 2293-8893, which we will put in chat. But I think that comment about Galaxy segues very nicely into this, which is, what is your favorite method, framework, or tool to document interoperability or sustainable workflows? You can put it in Menti, but you're also welcome to put it in chat, say out loud. I don't have one. Yeah. Lucid chart. Project management tools. Trying to find one. Okay, whiteboarding tool. There isn't a good one. Yeah. Yeah, as we've been exploring these different options, I'm trying to get an idea of what's out there. Edom. Yes. Wonderful. Dana, would you go to the next one, please? So thinking back on, you can answer for yourself or your institution as we're trying to continue to build out MaLDReTH, trying to continue to build the community as well as the different use cases that are out there. How do you yourself or your institution see yourself using a MaLDReTH framework? How might it help you or assist you? And once again, you can put this in Menti or feel free to unmute, add in the Zoom chat, however you'd like to respond. No idea. Mhm. Is to identify gaps in our services for researchers, structures, and organize our researcher-facing services so that researchers can better find and use them based on MaLDReTH research lifecycle. Wonderful. Broadly validated as a reference to realign existing registries, thinking about it. Andrew, yes, I believe we can do that. Is that correct, Athena?
Sorry, I was nodding, but I realized I have my camera off. Yes, no problem at all. I will do that.
Thank you. Thank you. Identify gaps, improve interoperability. Okay, wonderful. So I think we're slowing down a bit on this one. If we could go to the last one, please, Athena. So as we've discussed throughout this presentation, there's a number of different steps that we're aiming to take as we launch MaLDReTH 2 and begin to approach these different areas of work. We want to know from you, the people, our potential adopters, as well as those potentially interested in learning more about MaLDReTH or working on MaLDReTH, where do you think this group should focus as far as the different 4 areas, such as standardizing approaches for tool interoperability, establishing consistent documentation patterns, exploring this sustainability, and engagement with adopters of MaLDReTH? Is there an area that you would prioritize one over the other? Okay, we're seeing quite a lot for focus on standardizing approaches for tool interoperability. Would someone who answered yes to prioritizing that, would you be willing to unmute and talk a little bit more about why that might be?
Shy bunch.
What did you say, Adam?
I said a shy bunch.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Or if you want to add either to the chat or put it in the notes,
Mhm.
it's really useful to have some kind of background on the reason for prioritizing that, because it helps to inform the way we shape the work that we're doing, which is for everyone.
All right. It seems as though, oh, yes.
Yeah, so I can mention that I voted for the engagement with adopters because interoperability implies that you are trying to connect some services to do something, and that's something you need to define. And I think the adopters are kind of the ones that would define where, to what degree, and under what circumstances you need the tools to be connected, and to what degree. I mean, where do you say that this is interoperable.
I would second that sentiment, Volmar. I completely agree. I think to me the interoperability and the adoption are intertwined and work together, which is what you're saying. So absolutely, agreed.
We have some comments in chat. I choose focusing on the standardization just because it's this thing I struggle with the most. I understand that as well. And then isn't the utility of MaLDReTH and the tools for research in general predicated on interoperability?
Maybe I could comment. I think that's a really good point. I think just maybe I think the answer is yes. But when we, in fact, we originally planned or hoped in MaLDReTH 1 to go beyond what we had done, and for each of the representative tools to have an attribute section where we listed certain attributes about them, that in a way that is more what InfraFinder has done in some respects. So for example, and some of the attributes that we thought would be relevant, one was open source or not open source, and another was interoperability. So it was, in a way, it was always our intention to incorporate interoperability into MaLDReTH, but we just bit off more than we could chew, and we ran out of time. And to some extent, it was realizing that we had a substantial amount of unfinished business that gave us the inspiration and incentive to go forward with MaLDReTH 2. So yeah.
Wonderful. Before I transition into our next steps, are there any other questions or comments from people, whether you want to raise your hand and unmute or add a question or comment in the chat? Giving it one more minute. All right, Athena, if you wouldn't mind opening up the slide deck, please, and we will just go on to this last point. All right, so thank you so much for hearing our presentation today. We are currently actively recruiting members for MaLDReTH 2. You can join as a member on our MaLDReTH 2 RDA page, or if you're interested in participating, whether that be in an upcoming workshop or as the group, within the group as a member, in your community notes document, there is a sign up at the bottom of the doc. Just a little bit more information as far as how we see this group running. It will be an 18-month working group timeline. We anticipate monthly meetings, which include workly meetings as well as planning meetings, and there will be additional task forces and projects such as the 4 focuses that we have, as well as working with GORC and other communities involved. And as we continue to move forward and continue to adapt to the MaLDReTH framework, we're excited to speak with people and continue outreach with the global community. So thank you all so much for joining us today. That is it from me. Rory, Adam, do you have anything else you would like to add?
Yes, thanks everyone. Feel free to either add contact details, ideas, feedback to the notes, and we look forward to working with you all in the coming months.
And ditto for me.
Thank you all.
Right. Thanks all. Just gonna drop the working group page also in the chat now, and make sure to sign up as we're looking for active members, as Hali said. So with that, again, thanks a lot for your participation and your contributions. All right, enjoy the rest of your plenary. See you around. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.